This is a hard one. And notice I didn't say that's what she said, so you've got to congratulate me. What does it mean to say practice is enlightenment if mostly it doesn't feel like it? Yeah, that's a tough one. This was Dogen's big sort of revelation that really formed the core of what he subsequently taught. Was this idea that practice itself is enlightenment. Because before that, he had understood practice, meaning meditation practice and other practices that he might have learned, because the first form of Buddhism he was involved in was Tendai Buddhism, which tends to have loads of ceremonies and stuff. And then he was involved in the Rinzai form of Zen for a number of years. And I don't want to. It's bad to generalize, but I'm going to generalize a little bit anyway. In those forms of Buddhism, it's usually understood that practice is a means to enlightenment, so that you practice in order to achieve enlightenment. So the practice, so often in the Nishijima cross translation of Shobo Genzo, you'll see practice and experience, I think, is usually the way it's phrased. But the experience, it took me a while to catch on to this. The experience that they're referring to is the experience of awakening, satori, some kind of an enlightenment experience. And he will say things like, if you think of practice and experience as two things, as the ordinary person does, you'll never get anywhere, or something like that. I can't remember the phrase. He says, kind of like, in conventional terms, you might think of practice and experience as two different things, but in reality, understand that they are always one thing. That there is no practice that is not experience, which means the experience of satori, enlightenment, awakening, whatever you want to call it. But when you first sit down to practice Zazen, and me after 40-some years of practicing Zazen, when I sit down and practice over there with all of you, it's not feeling most of the time like enlightenment, it's feeling like, stop thinking about, shoes or whatever, I don't know what I'm thinking about. But, I'll go through all these trains of thought and go, oh, come on, keep practicing, and, stop getting that going on. And it just feels, it can feel boring, or it can, can feel painful, or it can feel a lot of ways, but it often doesn't feel like enlightenment. But it is the actual practice of enlightenment. I mean, that's one of the ways to look at it. There's a lot of ways to look at it, but one of the ways to look at it is that when you take on that posture and do that thing, you are doing the Buddha's activity. You're doing the actual activity that Shakyamuni Buddha did 2,500 years ago. And that in itself is a kind of enlightenment. Nishijima Roshi would often say sometimes that there are two kinds of enlightenment. There's first enlightenment and second enlightenment. And first enlightenment is just the practice, however it feels. Even if it feels lousy, like you've completely failed at doing Zazen, that's still a kind of enlightenment. And then he would acknowledge that there is this thing called second enlightenment. He called second enlightenment, which is after you've done that for a long time. It usually takes people 20 or 30 or more years for anything to really happen. So this is a hard practice to sell. There are guys out there on the internet who tell you that they can give you an enlightenment experience on the very first day, and it costs $50,000. I'm not even making that one up. I saw that. So if you want to go pay $50,000 to somebody to go have enlightenment on the very first day, that's your money. Good luck to you. I think the best you can have in with that sort of thing is just, there might be a way to psychologically manipulate a person into having some kind of a whiz-bang experience after a day of practice, I don't know exactly what this guy is doing to the people that he's getting his money from. But that's not, that I don't think there's any great value in experiences like that. They're just a bit of excitement. So yeah, the practice is looking. Okay, I'll give you my story on this one. When I first started working with Nishijima Roshi.
Okay, what I meant to say there is when I first started working with my first Zen teacher, Tim. So I said Nishijima, but I meant Tim, and now the rest of it's going to make sense. Okay, let's see the rest of it.
One of the people in my life was this woman who was a born-again Christian who really wanted me to become a born-again Christian too. And she didn't like the fact that I kept going and seeing this Zen dude and practicing Zazen. And she had a conversation with Tim, unbeknownst to me, in which she later reported to me as, Tim said you'll never reach enlightenment. Tim said, and I heard that, and I was kind of too shy to ask Tim what the deal was for years about that conversation. And at the time I thought, well, by then I was pretty committed to Zazen practice, and I could see that it was beneficial, and I wanted to keep doing it. And I thought, well, I will just now make my practice to fully experience the state of non-enlightenment. Rather than using my practice as a way to reach enlightenment, I will focus on seeing clearly what the non-enlightened state that I have is, and what my incapacity to experience enlightenment is all about. Much later on, probably after I got rid of this person from my life, I asked him about that, and he said, "Oh, her, yeah, she had a lot of weird ideas." And he said, "I don't remember that conversation, but whatever she was putting forth as enlightenment was pure fantasy. So that's probably why I told her that." So he wasn't actually saying that I was incapable of being enlightened. But I think that was really useful, and I'm kind of glad that happened. That hearing that this conversation had happened with my teacher made me not drop the practice, but instead use the practice as a way to see what the unenlightened state is. And what Dogen says often is that even your doubts and even your misgivings and even your delusion is an aspect of enlightenment. So even your deepest delusion is, because enlightenment encompasses everything, is another aspect of enlightenment. So you don't have to worry about having some kind of special state. You just kind of keep practicing this stuff. And, as somebody who's done it for a long time, I can say that stuff does start to happen, but it takes a long time for it to happen. And if you try to push it or force it, I think all you're going to get, as I just said, is a kind of an exciting psychological state that might be, a bit of a thrill and something, if you're so inclined, you could write a book about. I see people writing books about these things all the time. But I don't think it's all that valuable. I think it's just something the brain does, and you can go, whoa. And even so-called genuine enlightenment experiences, you have to let those go. So that, you're not going to have the permanent enlightened state. I think is kind of an illusion. And I think this is held out or emphasized. I think it's something it's evident in the literature. How about we put it that way? Because I remember reading a book It's by Hajime Nakamura, I think is his name, and it's called Gautama Buddha, and it's in 2 volumes, and it's impossible to find anymore because I looked for it, and Amazon wanted $900 for it for a copy. I got mine for like $10. But it's incredibly boring, but he takes this really deep dive into what the actual literature in Buddhism says about the founder. And one of the things that really was interesting to me that he pointed out in this book is that in the way it's kind of come down in popular understanding of Buddha's enlightenment is that he's sitting under the Bodhi tree and Mara comes. And Mara is sort of this Satan-like figure, and it's very much like Christ's temptation in the desert by Satan. I sometimes wonder if the Buddhist story influenced, the Christian story. I'm not saying it did, so don't crucify me. But it's really similar, and often if you see a statue of Buddha, I don't know if any of the ones around here have this. He's touching the ground. He's sitting there. He's often got a bowl in his hand, in usually I think in the left hand, and his right hand is touching the ground with 2 fingers. That's a kind of typical statue of Buddha, and the bowl represents that he'd gone to this ascetic practice and he was starving himself to death, and this girl who was taking an offering of rice to offer to a statue of one of the Hindu gods saw this poor starving guy and gave him her bowl of rice instead of putting it in front of the statue, and the Buddha accepted and he ate that, and that's supposed to be his entry into the middle way that Buddhism talks about. But the hand on the ground is to represent what he does when Mara is tempting him, and he sort of touches the ground as his grounding in reality, and Mara goes away. But what Nakamura points out in his book is that version isn't the way it was originally told. In the original version of the Buddha's story, life story that was circulated in earlier times, Mara appears throughout Buddha's life. Mara is there in that moment, that's preserved in the popular story, but he appears throughout Buddha's life, even until the end of his life. There's stories of Mara appearing. And I don't think that means the Buddha was visited by a demon, or Satan or something. But I think it was meant to represent that even the Buddha was not free of the karma that he had, that was part of his, being a human. So he was still dealing with his stuff, even up till the end of his life. So yeah, I don't know where I was going with
Question,
that.
Brad.
Yeah.
Could you just rewind a moment to what Dogen's actually said then? Because I understood it that to do Zazen is enlightenment.
Yeah.
What you said sounded like an inference that Zazen and experience is enlightenment.
Well, no, he talks about practice and experience, but he says they're not 2 different things. So by practice he means Zazen, by experience he means enlightenment. So he's constantly using this, I've forgotten the Japanese, but I don't think anybody here speaks Japanese anyway, but there's this phrase that he uses over and over, practice and experience. And he's trying to emphasize that they're the same thing. So the practice is the experience. So yeah, it's not separated.
That's good news then, isn't it, really?
Yeah, it was for me, because I'm as frustrated by Zazen as anybody, to be honest. I one of the things I find in these retreats is everybody else gets to do Zazen, but I kind of don't seem to be able to. That's overstating it. But because I have to spend half the day talking to people and just hearing stuff from people, one of the things you're supposed to do in a retreat, I guess the thing is, everybody else gets to do a retreat and I don't. Rather than, I get to do Zazen, but I don't get to do a retreat. And part of what the what you're doing with the retreat is you're trying to get away from that stuff and not put a bunch of new information into your mind and excite your mind. But you know, I'm exciting my mind the entire time, or during a retreat. So that my advice to you is avoid doing that. I mean, you come to Dokusan, it's fine, and I don't mind it. It's part of the job, but it's I think if for those of you who want to really experience a retreat, it's best to kind of stay away from all forms of stimulation, and it's really easy. One of the things I liked about Tassajara and about Mount Baldy Zen Center, and about Shizuoka when we would go to these retreats in Shizuoka, is that they were all so far away from the cell towers that you couldn't get reception. So even if you were tempted to check your social media, you couldn't do it. And they were also far away from people, so like normal people. So no, you were kind of secluded. But when you do a retreat in a place like this, or a place like Benedictushof, where I was before, or in Lami, Finland, where I was, Lami is actually pretty isolated. So any of you who want to have a really super isolated retreat that's actually not that far away, it's at least closer than Japan, come to one of my retreats in Finland, because we're way up there. We're not quite in the Arctic Circle, but we're pretty far away from any city or town. And it's real isolated, and that one has more of a feeling of a retreat, like I'm kind of used to, where you're really separated from things. But that means you have to kind of use your willpower to not get involved with stuff. And that's also why we keep the silence. Don't harsh people's mellow with the silence.